Biological Code Podcast, a podcast on Germanische Heilkunde. Today we're talking about the heart attack. Dr. Hammer once examined a patient in a university clinic. This patient, let's call him John, had suffered an acute heart attack, so he must have resolved a territorial loss conflict which affects the coronary arteries, bringing the heart attack in the epicrisis. To clarify, we might have many conflicts in life, but a biological conflict always consists of the following three criteria. It is experienced as highly acute dramatic, unexpected, and in perceived isolation. In this way, the body now adapts to the situation with a significant biological special program. A territorial loss conflict has its brain relay in the right side of the cerebral cortex. It is therefore a masculine perceived conflict. We can also deduce that John must have been right-handed, because if he would have been left-handed and had experienced a territorial loss conflict, he would have reacted with the coronary veins, due to the so-called night hop, leading to a pulmonary embolism in the epicrisis, not to a heart attack of the coronary arteries. The question now was, what was the content of John's territorial loss conflict that he had resolved? And so during his examination, he was asked by Dr. Hammer when and what territorial loss conflict he had experienced. As many of you may know, John's answer was a very common first response when people are questioned about their conflicts. I have experienced no territorial loss. He was a successful innkeeper. The dignitaries of the entire village were his guests. He had 2 healthy children, a good wife, no financial worries, everything was fine. There was no question of a territorial conflict. But as Dr. Hammer was the founder of the 5 biological laws, he knew there must have been a territorial loss conflict. So he asked him, since when had he gained weight? From 6 weeks ago, he replied. From the results of the EKG, Dr. Hammer could roughly assess that the heart attack hadn't been particularly severe. He calculated that the conflict could have lasted only several months, with the conflict resolution 6 weeks ago. Now he said, something terrible must have happened around 6 months ago. Something that cost you many sleepless nights, and about 6 or 8 weeks ago, the matter was resolved. Well, now, doctor, that you mention it, there was something, but no, I really can't imagine that something like that could cause a heart attack. But as it turned out, John's great pride had been an aviary with exotic birds. All his guests were allowed to admire these birds. He hadn't spared any expense, even the rarest species were among them. Daily before breakfast, he would check on his birds. There were about 30 by now in his collection. One morning, his jaw dropped. All the birds had disappeared, except for one little bird. Thieves, was his first thought. Thieves have broken into my territory! And this shaped his biological conflict. Can you hear the territorial loss? Neighbors came and examined the entire aviary from top to bottom. After a while, they found a tiny little hole that had been dug through from under the enclosure. An experienced farmer uttered just one word. Weasel! From then on, the patient had only one single thought in his head. Catch the weasel. After several failed attempts, he finally succeeded. Only now could he proceed to rebuild the aviary, make it weasel-proof, and purchase new birds. After about 3.5 months, everything was back in order and the conflict was definitely resolved. In the conflict active phase, the squamous epithelium of the coronary arteries reacts with ulcers, that is, cell loss. The tissue becomes thinner so that more blood can flow to the heart. The biological meaning of this special program is to become more powerful in order to resolve the territorial conflict as quickly as possible. The affected person has compulsive thinking and is in sustained sympathikotonia. You could also say under constant stress. He has little appetite and sleeps poorly because he thinks day and night about how he can win back his territory. At the same time, the affected person has angina pectoris. Angina pectoris is typically felt as pain pressure, or tightness in the chest, often behind the breastbone. This is because the tissue of the coronary arteries is extremely sensitive. Biologically, men often don't talk about such physical symptoms, and so this phase can easily remain undetected. With the conflict resolution, the pain stops abruptly. Everything seems fine again, although the squamous epithelium of the coronary arteries now swells considerably and are thereby usually blocked. But this swelling isn't the cause of the pending heart attack. As a side note, there once was a study performed in which larger coronary vessels were clamped in animals. It was presumed that a heart attack would follow, but none occurred. Instead, natural bypasses, so-called collaterals, formed after a short time. As you can see from this study, the body cleverly builds its own bypasses if necessary. During the healing phase, the appetite now returns and the patient starts to gain weight. The heart attack inevitably occurs in the middle of the healing phase, like a bolt from the blue. It happens in the so-called epicrisis, which wrenches the rudder back toward health. The swelling or fluid is squeezed out, both from the corresponding brain relay and from the swollen squamous epithelium of the coronary arteries. During this time, signals that would usually come from the brain relay to the organ no longer take place. The heart attack is actually a brain symptom, and the size of the conflict mass determines the severity of the resulting infarction. With more than 9 months of conflict mass, the heart attack is usually fatal because the signals from the brain are absent for too long. John had a conflict mass of 3.5 months, so no life-threatening heart attack could occur. When John thought about it afterwards, he had been very proud during the conflict active phase to have lost a few kilos. But for the past 6 weeks, he had gained it all back, and even a few kilos more. I can hardly think of anything that could have hit me harder than having my bird stolen, he said. The individual perception with the 3 criteria for a biological conflict determines whether and how a person reacts to an event. Every person is an individual and therefore perceives differently. Therefore, there can be no universally valid assignment of events to conflicts, but rather each affected person must be questioned quite individually according to the biological laws of nature to discover the conflict. Therefore, we cannot assume what biological program will run after a DHS, but rather each affected person must be asked individually about their perception at the time of the DHS to identify their specific conflict. Here, someone, even if it was only a little weasel, had invaded and destroyed John's territory. He could have immediately started renovating his aviary, but since he had not yet found the invader, he would have had no peace. Only after he had neutralized the enemy could he rebuild his territory in peace. You can literally feel the biological drama of his territorial conflict. John did everything biologically correct and immediately took possession of his territory again. Knowing Germanische Heilkunde and understanding the connections of the 5 biological laws of nature is invaluably important knowledge. We understand ourselves much better and also how nature helps us, both to resolve our biological conflict and to reverse the changes that have occurred in the body once the conflict is resolved. And quite automatically, you will probably lose your fear of so-called diseases, bit by bit. Learn to think biologically. The knowledge of Germanische Heilkunde belongs in every household. If you want to learn more about how to apply the 5 biological laws into your everyday life, you can find more information on our association's website, urkraftleben.at, or join our program at thebiologyproject.org. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Telegram, and Instagram. You can now find this podcast also on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening. Until next time.